Hello, I'm Roger Bisbee from the Skill Builder channel, and I would like to talk to you today about damp. In fact, a very specific type of damp. Vapour and vapour control. Why do we want to control the vapour? Well, as you've just seen on this board, vapour condenses. And what we don't want it doing is condensing in the wrong places, because if vapour condenses in the wrong places, it leads to mould, mildew, dry rot. Some of you will have probably got a loft, an attic, a place doing nothing at the top of your house. Sometimes when you go up there, you find that there's lots and lots of little droplets of water coming off the sarking felt on the inside of your roof. And the reason it's getting damp is because moisture is travelling up from the house into the loft. The moisture is created by us doing things like breathing, having a shower. You create moisture. Everybody in the house creates moisture. So what you've got is moisture that's drifting up because it's warm, it's in the air. It will vary according to the time of year as well. But that humidity is hitting the plasterboard ceiling here. One of the places it can get up into the loft is around the little loft hatch that we've got here, because if that's not sealed all the way round effectively, then you've got air escaping through there, you've got a little draft going through there, and that air contains moisture. You might also have some lights here, and you might have a cable coming through there, and that cable is allowing a little bit of air to come through, and that is allowing a little bit of moisture to come through. Now you might think they're small things, but they all add up. You might also have some pipes, because you might have a tank in the loft. Your tank might not have a lid, so there's a bit of evaporation coming off there, but also around those pipes, they weren't sealed up properly when the plumber put them through the ceiling, and so you've got a little bit of moisture that's coming up through here. So you seal off all those points, which is a good thing to do, but you've still got moisture in the roof space. Where's that moisture coming from? Well, believe it or not, a lot of it is actually travelling through the sheetrock. It's travelling through the plasterboard. It's migrating. Even a solid sheet of plasterboard with no holes in it or anything like that can let through about half a pint of water over the course of a year. Now that doesn't sound a lot, obviously, but that's only one sheet of plasterboard. So what have we got on the ceiling? We've got maybe 10 sheets of plasterboard on the ceiling. So let's have a look at that. Half a pint of water at a time, 5 pints. So we've got 5 pints of water, which is actually just getting through the ceiling on its own. So what do? Before we put the plasterboard up, we put in a vapour barrier, which could be a polythene sheet, or it could be something a little bit posher, because they do actually sell polythene sheet, which is more expensive because it's called vapour barrier, but actually it does work better, because even polythene sheets sometimes can let a little bit of moisture through. So you've got that, and it's very, very important that when you do that, you tuck it up on the sides here, that you seal all the joints through there, that you make a good job of sealing any points where the cables, the pipes, anything else comes through, and we keep that moisture from migrating up into the roof space. And we do our best, but we're never going to completely succeed at that game, because for one reason and another, maybe it's you going up into the loft, all sorts of other reasons, you may get a little bit of moisture up there. But the best thing to do is control it at this point. Now the other way you can control it is with plasterboard, which is foil backed, and that is a vapour control in itself. That foil back, that silver foil on the back of the plasterboard, stops the moisture from migrating through the plasterboard. Other than that, there are a few joins and things like that, but you get the idea. We're stopping most of the moisture getting up into there. So that condensation that we got on the roof space is much reduced. On the underside of that sarking felt, it's not so pronounced. Now, if that sarking felt is the old-fashioned type, the bitumen type, then it will just condense because it can't go through. But now what we've got is wonderful things which they call breather membranes. So when we put the tiles on the roof and we put that under tile layer in there, that sarking felt, that membrane, instead of using something like bitumen, which was impermeable, we now use a fabric which allows vapor to go through but repels water. So as the water falls from the sky, if it gets through the tiles, if it's wind blown or anything like that, it then runs down the outside and hopefully safely into our little gutters there. All the moisture that's in the loft hopefully can escape through the permeable membrane and away it goes. Now, people are relying on permeable membranes completely these days, and sometimes they're finding that they've still got problems. So if you look at an old house, if you look at an existing house and the roofer comes along, he's going to put a new roof on for you, and he says, what you need there, you need a permeable membrane. We're going to stick that on. They always stick that on now because it's much lighter and it's got quite cheap actually. So they always put that on, and then they say, yeah, you don't need any vents in your roof, you don't need any little places for the moisture to escape because you've got this wonderful breather membrane on there, and that's taking care of any moisture. It's breathing, basically. It's letting all that moisture out, which is absolutely lovely. And of course, as it warms up in that loft and it dries out and that vapor is enhanced, if you like, if it's sitting on the underside of there and it warms up, it will go through a lot more effectively. But obviously in the winter, it doesn't go through quite as well, because what it does is it goes up through the loft, through the insulation. You've got a nice layer of insulation here, goes through the insulation and it hits that membrane and it condenses. The water droplets appear on the inside. Now, there's a wonderful fabric called Gore-Tex that I happen to be lucky enough to own some of, and I use it for walking, I use it for all kinds of things, and even for cycling. And when you start building up a bit of a sweat, when you're going up the hill and you start sweating profusely, then that moisture is leaving your body at a rate, and it goes through the pores in the Gore-Tex because you've got tiny little holes in the Gore-Tex, and the moisture can get out but the rain can't get in. Absolutely wonderful thing. When you start producing too much moisture and it's cold and that moisture starts condensing on the inside of the Gore-Tex, then it's got to wick through. It's got to find its way through that fabric to the outside. And if it's cold and you're sweating a lot, it's not going to do it as well as it might if you were just gently ambling along and it was a slightly warmer day. So there is a limit to what all these things can do. There's a limit to what these vapor membranes can do, that they have, the permeable membranes that they have on the roof. And the more expensive ones have got several layers of fabric. It's a non-woven fabric, but it's got loads and loads of microscopic holes in it. Because of the way it's constructed, you've got an absorbent layer, if you like, on the inside, and that takes a little bit of the moisture, holds the moisture and allows it to evaporate in its own time. So it will just hold a bit. So that's a much better type of membrane than the very cheap ones. You also get something called open air membranes. You get something which is actually the air can pass through very, very freely both ways. So it's almost like having a ventilated roof space. It doesn't cut the drafts out because it still allows on a windy day air to flow through the loft and take some of that moisture away. So there are various standards for all these things. There are various grades, but the whole point about it is that if you've got a good membrane, if you put a better quality membrane on there, you're likely to have less problems. But it does depend upon you having a good vapor barrier here to stop that moisture going up. If you've got an old house and it's got old lath and plaster ceilings, they're lime plaster, and the moisture's going through it, then I'm afraid that you may still need to put some little vents in the roof to improve the ventilation. The vapor will also travel through the walls. Even if you've got brick walls, it's cold outside and it's warm inside. And as Isaac Newton said, heat will travel to cold. It won't travel the other way round. So that's a very, very important thing to remember. Our heat is traveling to cold. Now, when it's hot outside, and the hotter it is, the more moist the air is likely to be. In other words, warm air can hold a lot more moisture than cold air. So when it's hot outside and it's muggy and we can feel that moisture in the air, and you've got air conditioning on the inside, it's actually traveling the other way. If we've got something like a timber frame house, is we need to put that same vapor barrier there inside the wall, on the inside, on the warm side of the house, because if we stuck it on the outside, it would allow the moisture to travel through the insulation, whatever we got in there in the way of insulation, and it would hit the cold area, which would be on the other side of the insulation. So we've got a bit of insulation in there. If that moisture was allowed to travel through there, it would hit the cold on the other side of it and it would condense on that inside of the outside, if you like. So whatever you've got there, cladding or even brickwork or something else, you get moisture condensing on there. So it's very important that we try to stop it before it gets through the wall. So that vapor barrier, the positioning of that vapor barrier is very, very important. It's also very important that we join that vapor barrier to the one in the ceiling. We don't leave any gaps. We do a very good job because the devil is in the detail. It's always in the detail. Moisture is going to escape. It's going to escape through all those little bits and pieces. So we do a good job of taping and sealing all that vapor barrier all the way around the house, around the windows, around the doors, anywhere where it's possible for a bit of moisture to escape through the fabric of the building and find its way into that space the other side, where if it builds up it can start to cause rot and all kinds of other problems, mold and you name it. So we don't want it, we want to get rid of it. So that's just basically the principle of a vapor barrier and vapor control. But I did say to you that in the hot weather you can get exactly the opposite happening. So you get a situation where this is the cold because we've got air conditioning and this is the hot. So Isaac Newton is telling us that that hot is going to travel to cold. And of course it's going to get through the insulation, and when it gets through the insulation it's going to hit the cold surface on that side. So if it hits the cold surface on that side, it then condenses. You get condensation forming on the inside of that vapor control layer. You also get it soaking all the timber stud work and the insulation in your house. So what do you do in a situation like that? You know, maybe you think, okay, I'll put the vapor barrier on the outside and maybe that'll help, and therefore it'll stop the vapor getting through before it goes through, which is wonderful. It's wonderful in the summer, but what happens in the winter? In the winter, when that is now cold, and if you think of some places, you think of Canada where they get great extremes on the prairies of very, very bitterly cold winters but very hot summers, and that situation is likely to change season by season. So putting a vapor control barrier in a situation like that is kind of a no-win, because at some point in the year it's going to be working against you. So there are people who say, well, the best thing to do, not put a vapor barrier in there at all, to actually leave it out and to just let the free passage of moisture go through the wall in whichever direction it wants to go through, but at least it's not being trapped inside. You know, when it gets inside, we need to get rid of it, we need to dehumidify it, which it will do to a certain extent, because as soon as it hits that cold surface, that's what's going to happen. If it gets to the outside, it's just going to disappear harmlessly out to the outside, provided we haven't stuck something on the outside of the building which is a non-breathable, if you like, something like a PVC siding or cladding or something like that. There isn't an ideal answer. What we're trying to do is stop the majority of that moisture from getting in and harming the house. And of course the other way you do it is you build your house from things which are not going to be affected by moisture. So if you're having timber, you have pressure treated timber which will be less inclined to rot. But that's one situation. But of course you've got a lot of people who live in houses with flat roofs. Unfortunate people, because a flat roof is never going to be as good as a pitch roof, simply because water runs downhill. But here you've got the same situation. You've got the same bloke or his brother, and his brother is still washing. He's still doing all the things. His brother is still breathing, hopefully. So he's still creating moisture in this house. Now that moisture is going up into the flat roof this time. So he's got a layer of insulation in this flat roof. And if he's got it like that, this is what we call a cold roof. The insulation is all stuck on there. And this is very important, that when the insulation is stuck on there, we want to have some kind of ventilation going through in these joists. So all those joists need a hole in them if we try to get cross ventilation, or they've got holes in the front here in the fascia which allow the air to go through. But whatever happens, we want air passing through there and coming out there, or the other way around, doesn't matter. But the idea is that any moisture that escapes up there, it hits the cold side, it hits the cold spot in here, and we need to get rid of it. That same thing as the pitch roof, exactly the same principle, but on a flat roof. So what we do on a flat roof, we try still to put a vapor barrier in here, because we want to stop the majority of moisture going up into that flat roof. And one thing we don't do on any of these roofs, whether it's a pitch roof or a flat roof, is put downlighters in, because as soon as you start drilling the ceiling to put your little downlighters in, and the downlighters, even the fireproof ones, have got ventilation because they get a bit warm and they need to vent. As soon as you do that, you've got basically an extractor. You've got moisture that's coming up here. You've got a little light in there which is slightly warm, less so with the LED ones, but still slightly warm. And of course the moisture is just traveling through there and escaping. So how many downlighters do people put in their house? Well, sometimes you go to a kitchen and you see 20 downlighters in a kitchen. So that's 20 spaces through breaching that vapor barrier where you can get moisture going through to your roof. And then suddenly you find you've got damp patches and you're wondering what's going on. You think you've got a leaking roof. You call the roofer around. He looks upstairs. There's nothing wrong with your roof. It's probably what they call interstitial condensation. So if he's a clever guy, he says to you, we'll increase the ventilation across there and we'll try to do something about those downlighters. Use a different type of light. That would be the sensible thing to do. But of course, people are wedded to these ideas of downlighters. They love them. And if they love them, then they've got to also love the fact that they're rotting their building to bits. More and more these days is we have what we call a warm roof. Now, it is generally considered that a warm roof is better than a cold roof. Sounds logical, doesn't it, really? I mean, who wants a cold roof? But the idea of a warm roof is that we've got all our joists there, we've got our plasterboard there, and we have another piece of decking going across the top, another bit of OSB 3 or whatever, plywood, whatever you're going to use, going across there. And then we put the insulation on the top, and then we put another layer of decking on the top, and then we put on, increasingly it'd be GRP or something like that, but whatever you want to put on, single membrane or whatever, but that membrane will go on the top. Now, if we didn't have a vapor barrier, the vapor could still come up through here, get through that insulation and appear on the underside of the waterproof covering, whatever that was. As I say, whether it's a single ply membrane, whether it's GRP or whatever it is, what we'd end up with is moisture that is trapped in here, under there, and it will start rotting that, and again we get spongy bits. You go up sometimes and it's like Weetabix up there. You can just push your foot straight through it. Often people find out, they go up there to do something and they just put their foot through the roof. They think, oh my goodness. The way we get around this to some extent is we put a vapor barrier in, but we don't put the vapor barrier in there. Because what we want to do in this particular case is to keep all that space that's warm, all that space is heated. Now, we don't want to start putting insulation in there, even though you think, oh, that'd be a good idea. I'll put some in there, and what they might call a hybrid roof, where you've got a little bit of insulation in here, you've got a bit of insulation there. But of course, that's a problem, because what you then get is you've warmed up this lot, but you've created a slightly cooler surface there. So even though you've got insulation on top, it's a relative thing. It's a bit cooler than this. So as the vapor carries up through the ceiling and so on, we've still got a ceiling in here, by the way, plasterboard ceiling. So that plasterboard is letting through, as we said, maybe about half a pint of water per year per 8x4 sheet. We still need to watch it, and if we've got any kind of breaches in there, any kind of cables running through there, we've still got this situation where we've got some moisture going up there. So what we need then is we need to put our vapor barrier on top of this piece of decking. So this is a piece of plywood or OSB, like I said, and that sits there. That is within the warm area of the house. And then we put in some kind of purpose-made vapor barrier in there. So this plywood that's here is on the warm side of the building, so that's not going to rot. Now any moisture that comes up, it's going to get through the plywood, it's going to permeate through the plywood, and it's going to appear on there. But it's because that's warm, it's just going to evaporate. It's going to carry on evaporating. So we're not going to get too much trouble from that. So we've got a vapor barrier here. We make sure our vapor barrier is going all the way up there, that it's doing a good job, and that no vapor can get into our decking and onto the underside of there. That's the important thing. We don't want any moisture appearing on the underside of that membrane. So everything is good. The only trouble is that I have spoken to flat roofers, guys who do nothing else but flat roofing, and they go round to properties and they find that even when they've got a vapor barrier in, there's still problems with moisture collecting on the underside of his decking up here. So it's still managing to get through to some extent and cause some kind of rotting. So there are guys who say, do you know what, the best thing to do, we go back to this problem that we got in, say, Canada or whatever, where we've got change in seasons, and they say the best thing to do is actually not bother about putting that membrane in and just let the moisture go in there, but also escape, because as that warms up and it dries out, it's got an escape route back into there. So the problem with a vapor barrier is once any water gets through it, you're trapping it, if you like, both sides. So you have to make sure it's done really, really well. But of course, the other thing you can do is you can stop the moisture in the house. And the way to stop the moisture in the house is not to stop breathing, not to stop showering or doing any of those lovely things that you like to do, cooking and things like that, but to put yourself in extractor fans here so that you're getting rid of the moisture as it appears. You could have an extractor fan in there if you liked, with the ducting that went out there, but whatever it is, you've got a shower upstairs, you definitely need one in there. You just let all the moisture escape, and the more you can do to get rid of the moisture at source, the less problem you're going to have here. So that would be my first piece of advice, is take care of the moisture at source, and then you won't have so much of a critical job to do here. If it did migrate through, if you found that you were getting a little bit of moisture through, it could actually evaporate and not cause too many problems. But there's always going to be some moisture, basically. You're never ever going to get rid of it totally, but if you can reduce it, you can save yourself having those horror stories where you find people with condensation. Because once you've got moisture, once you've got condensation, of course you've got mold. And mold, as we all know now, is toxic. It's not good for your health, and you really don't want to have it in your house. So we do everything we can to avoid the moisture from ending up in these cold corners where we don't want it. That means we never dry washing in the house on the radiator. As tempting as that is to hang your smalls over the radiator to dry them off, it does create extra moisture in the house, and that will create more condensation, more damp. And this is of course a kind of condensation, if you like. It's a condensation problem, but it's the unseen condensation. Now, we've mentioned timber frame and all the rest of it, but we also have to talk about brick. And when we've got a brick wall here, instead of having timber, we've got a cavity here, and we've got an inner skin and an outer skin. That moisture is still going to migrate through that blockwork, through that brickwork, and it's going to get outside. When it gets outside, when it gets through that internal layer, and maybe it hits a bit of cavity wall insulation that's in here. Some people love it, some people hate it. But if it gets through, it's going to travel through that cavity wall insulation. The place it condenses we call the dew point, and the dew point in this particular case is the inside of the outside skin, because that outside brickwork is going to be the same temperature on the outside. Supposing it was 5 degrees centigrade there, or Celsius, it's going to be 5 degrees Celsius on that point there. So the dew point here would be on the other side of that insulation. That's where it would be getting damp, and that's where it would start to trickle down and hopefully safely drain into the bottom and through the foundations and away. Or some people have a step damp proof course in here, and they have weep vents, and it trickles down there and it gets away there. But if we don't have an impermeable layer on the outside, if we've got brickwork or we've got block work and we've got nice lime render or something that isn't really tight, then a lot of that moisture is just going to carry on evaporating through the outer surface of the brickwork. And of course, as soon as we start sealing that up with non-vapor permeable layers, then we do create that problem of we're trapping the moisture in. Not the end of the world, because it can still escape to a certain extent down there, but of course some of it will start to make the insulation wet, and of course it gets worse if we've got driving rain coming in to that brickwork and soaking that brickwork. So we've got water trying to get onto the outside, we've got water coming onto the inside, we've got saturated brickwork, and of course then it begins to saturate the insulation, and of course wet insulation is no insulation at all. So then the next thing we find is we're getting damp patches on the inside, normally where the wall ties are. All these things are solvable. Best thing you can have is some kind of vapor permeable layer on the outside, and that will solve the problem. And there are plenty of products around now. Had some guy came on the other day when I was talking about Storm Dry, and he said that is impossible. He said that is complete bollocks. He said that can't happen. He said because there is nothing on this planet that can stop water coming in that will not trap water or water vapor going out. And he is so totally wrong about that, that it just beggars belief. But this is what people do. They come on, they think they know what they're talking about, and actually they don't. There are loads and loads of vapor permeable products out there, and all you've got to do is look for them. Whether they're in the form of breather membranes, which go under your roof tiles, or whether they're in the form of other coatings that you put on the building, there are plenty that will allow that transmission of moisture. And the reason they'll allow it is because water vapor is very, very fine indeed. If you imagine, it's steam basically, and even though you can't see it in the air, steam is coming off things. Even on a very cold day, water is evaporating off surfaces all the time, going up to form clouds. Obviously that happens more in the warm weather, but in the cold weather it's still happening. Things are drying out. Just remember, it's on the move all the time, and what we've got to do is just try and be aware of it and control it. I hope you found that interesting. It wasn't a rant. Sometimes I don't rant, sometimes I just talk, and I talked about that, and obviously there's going to be people who disagree with me on this. There are going to be people who want to add their little bit, and thank you very much, and do feel free to comment underneath. But also don't be surprised that if you talk complete nonsense, I will try and challenge you on it. I'm Roger Bisbee. Come back and see us soon on Skill Builder. We'll have lots more exciting stuff coming up. And don't forget, if you've got a particular damp problem, we've got Ask Skill Builder, where you can send in pictures of your damp problem, any video that you want to send in, and we'll do our best to try and help you.